In the past, product leaders and CPOs were seen as custodians of consumer products that you're building, right? And by consumer, I don't necessarily just mean B2C, but I think what is significantly shifting right now is rather than just being a custodian of that, the CPO has become a custodian of innovation for an organization. And especially with all of the development within artificial intelligence, CPOs are influencing in a big way where you would even invest in hiring talent or not. What parts would you automate? So the role is uniquely now transcending every part of the organization. It sets you up to have pretty rich impact, but in some other ways, it further adds to the challenge that you don't own a lot of things, but you're still in charge of thinking about those inputs that you don't necessarily control.
Welcome to Product Bar Raisers. In today's episode, I'm excited to welcome Priyankka. Priyankka is a seasoned product leader and has had a range of product leadership roles over several years, most recently as the Chief Product and Design Officer at Lonely Planet. Prior to this, Priyankka has held a range of roles at Amazon, spanning mobile shopping, Kindle CX, pricing systems, and Prime video marketing tech. Priyankka, excited to have you with us today. Welcome to Product Bar Raisers.
Thanks, Asim. Excited to be here and looking forward to reconnecting with you.
So Priyankka, diving right in, how do you describe the ideal Chief Product Officer role?
I would say a Chief Product Officer is somebody who drives the strategy and thinks about building a suite of products and services potentially for an organization in a sustainable way and in a way that is set up for scale. And where I think the Chief Product Officer role in a lot of ways, at a more early stage organization, differs from larger organizations is that there's an element of transformation involved in trying to think about how you would go about that entire journey. There's an element of working across the C-suite and the board and trying to think about how do you infuse product thinking? How do you influence decisions? How do you influence investments? How do you bring in consumer-focused thinking? So I think I would say it's an interesting mix of not just what you're trying to build and how do you monetize and how do you build something sustainably for the consumer, but there is also a really large element that is the how you would drive a transformation in that direction.
What's the transformation part of the role?
Think about the CPO role across three potential possibilities, right? Number one is when you're in an organization that is fairly tech driven, where everybody speaks the same language, your role over there primarily then is to really think about who is the consumer, what do I build for the consumer, what need am I solving for that consumer, and hence what does the roadmap look like, how would I partner with engineering and design to bring all of this to life, how is it going to make money, so on and so forth. The second possibility is that you are an existing traditional business. So my role at Lonely Planet, for instance, was exactly that, right? It is a traditional business that is looking to transform into a digital business sustainably, right? And to give you a little bit of context, Lonely Planet is, for folks that have not heard of the brand, Lonely Planet produces travel guides. They've been very popular over the years for decades, and you will often see a whole section that's dedicated to them in physical stores like Barnes and Noble. At some point in time, consumers, through the digital revolution, started to use TripAdvisor and Google, and there comes a point where a brand has to start thinking about how do I now make this work on the digital platform, right? So that's an example of a business that you're trying to transform that traditionally operated a certain way and now needs to be successful digitally. And then I'd say the third type of role in my mind is, let's say you have built a business on digital. So this isn't necessarily a 0 to 1 building conversation. You have built something, you have product market fit, you are, let's say, even profitable and driving revenue, right? But there comes a time in the stage of growth where you now have to think about how do I go from 100 to 1,000 to a 10,000, metaphorically speaking, right? right? And so in those organizations, you have CPOs that are trying to think more broadly about how to go beyond the business that they've built. Are there adjacencies that they should be investing in? Are there new products that they should be building that stay true to the vision but are different from the current offering, right? So depending on the stage of the organization, I'd say the role of how the CPO achieves this can vary quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that was an excellent way of putting it. One of the things that comes to mind for me is in a traditional business, when you're trying to do digital transformation, there is already a set of senior executives who are probably bought into that, but the organization as a whole may not have already bought into that. So what kind of challenges does that bring in for the CPO?
I would even push a little bit on that front and say, even the senior stakeholders, they might believe that they have bought into the idea of digital transformation, but there still is a lot of work to be done to get on the same page on what that means, right? And then there is a larger organization that may or may not be built to drive that digital transformation, right? Both culturally, both mindset-wise, and then talent-wise as well. So I'll address the first part first. The word almost scares me a little bit because it's such a broadly used term, and if you look around, everybody is driving digital transformation. I've heard that term even at Amazon, which is a fairly it is a tech company, and we still talked about transformation quite a bit, right? And so I would say for a CPO coming in, making absolutely sure that you and your C-suite and the board, right, are all on the same page on what do we mean by digital transformation. I've advised some startups. I've been in a digital transformation role myself, talked to a bunch of peers. And what is really interesting is if you go around the room and say, okay, great, we're digitally transforming brand XYZ. Asim, what do you envision when I say that versus what do I envision when I say that versus what does our CEO envision when he says that, he or she says that? And I think that you'll see that the answers differ quite a bit. Some people will think of it as process automation. Some people think about it as, hey, there's a physical, offering that we already have in place. All I want you to do is make me money the same way on the digital platform, right? Versus the way I might think about it as a CPO would be to say, okay, what need am I solving for the consumer? Is that need the same as what the physical world was solving? Would the way I would go solve that need look different? So for instance, let's think about a magazine in the subscription world offline, right? I pay money to subscribe and get a magazine delivered to me once a month, and I pay to actually consume that content technically, right? But if you bring that to the digital world exactly as it is and say, okay, now just make me money on the digital platform, it's unlikely to succeed because users have become so used to consuming content online for free. So the entire journey of digital transformation looks different. So that's number one. Number two, I would also talk about when we say digital transformation, are we talking only about the consumer product? Are we talking about processes and systems that go beyond that product? What does the business model look like? Would the business model be the same, offline versus online, so on and so forth, right? And so I think first getting on the same page with your C-suite and the board on what is it that we're building. And once you're on the same page, then taking that out to the organization to help them walk with you through that vision of how we're going to do that is super important. I think the other thing that I realized halfway through the journey is there is a lot of ambiguity, and how you think you're going to go about executing it shifts significantly month on month, right? You do things, you learn, doesn't work, you're going to pivot. And especially in the world of digital transformation, that makes people really nervous because there's a lot of research. I think McKinsey did a research recently that said, if I'm not wrong, only 7% of the companies that actually take on the job of digital transformation succeed. So you're already starting from a place of like there is pessimism around you, around whether this would work or not. And so when you constantly pivot, which is part and parcel of the process, but it makes the organization then feel like we don't have a clear vision of what's going on. And so I think building the muscle within the organization to view this as a continuous improvement process is important, as opposed to a destination that we figured out and now let's just go get there. Lastly, I think the organization itself, right? I've been in roles where I've just inherited a fairly traditional organization. Can you go take people who come from the more physical world, talent, and transform them into product managers? I think in some cases the answer is yes, in some cases the answer is no. And then you want to bring in some product thinking externally into the organization. And then it goes beyond your own organization as well. You want partner teams, whether it's operations or content or editorial or other teams, to also start thinking in a customer centric way, right? So there's all these different aspects that you need to think about to have a successful start.
Of everything that you said, what I felt was the most complex would have been the change in your revenue model, where once you were selling magazines and now you're saying, okay, we have to give it out in free.
More than changing the financial or the revenue model, I would say figuring out the right revenue model and having the patience to figure out the right revenue model. I've seen that tends to be a challenge, and I empathize with both sides of the problem, right? You have a business that is running and doing well and like clockwork generating revenue, and you're like, why can't you just take that online and make that happen, right? Versus my experience is that how do you even know what model is going to work, right? So if we were to build a digital product proposition, there's going to be a significant amount of experimentation and learning from the consumer and user research to even understand whether that's the right model. Once you figure out what you're going to monetize, what should the pricing tiers look like, so on and so forth. So it's a process, right? And so I think in my mind, the biggest challenge in the transformation journey is getting people to understand that yes, making money is the outcome, the eventual outcome that we all want, but you want to make money the right way, and that needs patience and time. You can't just have that answer in a couple of months. Products don't get built over a couple of months.
That's quite a range of things that a CPO has to focus on when you're working on a digital transformation. Does the rest of the organization understand that that's the CPO's role? Is there an agreement on what the CPO's role is?
I think different organizations do this differently, right? And the ones that do it right, I feel like they do define the role to a great extent. And particularly what does the CEO own versus what the CPO owns has to be really clear. I think that tends to be one of the challenges, right? So if you're in a more early stage organization, the CEO tends to want to have a lot of say in terms of what is the strategy and product market fit and so on. So do you even need a CPO at that stage? Versus when you're a little bit further along, then you kind of pass the baton on once you've figured out product market fit and some of the more strategic elements of just how does product fit into the larger business, then that delineation becomes clearer between a CEO role and a CPO role. I would say that across the organization, it tends to be fairly nebulous. It feels like saying we want to drive digital transformation. I've hired a CPO, go get it done, right? That happens a lot, and I think this is something. It's a new role, and so everybody's trying to figure out how to go about it. I really think the ideal world is one in which everybody owns digital transformation, but looks to the CPO on kind of setting the path on what are the different areas that technology will touch, right, during that transformation.
Now, coming to the companies which are scaling and the CPO role in companies which were startups, the founders were largely driving the roadmap. And at some stage when they're trying to scale, they want to bring in a professional CPO. So how do you see the role of a CPO in this stage of an organization, and how does it change as the size of the company grows?
I would say something maybe slightly controversial in that in the early stages, it is better to not bring in a CPO, right? And when you are seed is super early, but even in a sort of series A plus world, you're still trying to get the product market fit right. And I think that typically the CEO or the co-founders, the founders are super involved in what is it that you're building out. So it then neither is fair to somebody who comes in a CPO role, nor is it fair to the organization that you bring in someone as senior into a role when you're still trying to figure out the strategy and some of the pieces, right? And so what I've seen more early stage organizations do well is you still have the founder keenly involved in what you're going to build out, and they're almost donning the CPO hat, and then they bring in somebody that's a mid-level product individual who can come in and drive some of these things. So you can build a small team that can come in, and they're mostly doers, right, rather than massive thinkers. As you go further down that process, I would say the series B onwards, people start to think about bringing in a VP of product, right? So you bring in a VP of product. It is still not a CPO role, even if it technically reports into the CEO, because the CEO continues to play a more strategic role and is still at this point in time, in my experience, is still looking for somebody that definitely thinks a bit more strategically, but is more focused on building the right product culture, bringing the right people, delivering, building a roadmap, all of that, right? I think once you go down further down that funnel, Series C onwards, or pre-IPO, post-IPO, at this point, really, you're trying to bring in a CPO that can work across the C-suite to think about strategy. How are you going to make money? Are we going to invest in adjacencies? Is this the suite of products? How do I build for scale? Are my technical systems set up to scale? So that in my mind is where is that sweet space where a CPO role, you do most justice to that role.
Products are getting more technical. There's a lot more innovation happening in the market. The pace is picking up. How do you see the CPO role changing in this, and do you see any kind of evolution which is natural over the next 5 years?
I don't even know if it's the next 5 years or the next 2 to 3 years for all of this to happen. I think between the pandemic and then all of the technology revolution that's happened in the last 3 years, it feels like 10 years is being folded into 3 years in some ways, right? And so I'd say, in my mind, the one thing that is really significantly already starting to shift is that in the past, product leaders and CPOs were seen as custodians of consumer products that you're building, right? And by consumer, I don't necessarily just mean B2C, but you're thinking about who is the end consumer of that product or service, and you're building a suite of products, and so everything across that piece is owned by the product person, right? But I think what is significantly shifting right now is, rather than just being a custodian of that, the CPO has become a custodian of innovation for an organization. And now that innovation can happen within your HR systems and how you manage your talent. It could happen within operations. It could happen within the product that you build out, right? And especially with all of the development within artificial intelligence, CPOs are influencing in a big way where you would even invest in hiring talent or not. What parts would you automate? So the role is uniquely now transcending every part of the organization. And it in some ways it sets you up to have pretty rich impact, but in some other ways it further adds to the challenge that you don't own a lot of things, but you're still in charge of thinking about those inputs that you don't necessarily control.
What's the one piece of advice you would give to new people or new product leaders who are stepping into the CPO role?
The number one thing I would say, particularly if you are in a more emerging product space, coming in and grounding everybody in data and customer advocacy and building that culture out is, like, I feel like that's the backbone to anything you end up building. The first product I would build is data, if that makes sense. The second thing I would say is be willing to debate and challenge status quo. You don't, hopefully no organization wants somebody that just comes in and agrees with them, then they don't really need to hire that person into the role, right? So I would say building that debate culture, having that backbone to stand up and say what you think is the right thing to do, but use data and customer insights to back yourself, right? The third thing I would say is perseverance. It is not an easy job. It is a nebulous job. You're, in a lot of ways, you are defining for yourself and the industry, what is this role really going to do, right? So perseverance and not taking things personally is super important as you come into that role. And I think deeply linked to that is dual empathy. So having empathy for yourself, because there's all these different, you have to change the team, you have to bring in the right talent, you have to convince the board, you have to convince your C-suite, and go build a product and experiment and do all of this quickly, right? That tends to be the job description in some ways. And so yes, there is empathy for yourself that this is a tough job, but also empathy for the other side of the party, right? Like they are also going through a massive journey of transformation if they're building out a product organization in an existing organization.
What are some of the key reasons why this entire thing of digital transformation might fail?
I think mostly not having a common definition for digital transformation, right, is the number one reason for failure. If we don't even have the same goal, then we're likely, in somebody's eyes, failing, right? I think the second piece is the organization. So when a CPO is hired and bought into the role, there's a lot of pressure to say, I need you to go figure out all of these different things, but you're, as good as your team, right? And so if you do not hire the right people to do the job, and if you don't make those calls quickly, if you need to manage people out, or if you need to bring in different resources, not doing that quickly enough becomes a challenge. I think the third thing I would say is quality versus speed. The way I think about it is, there's, between the pandemic and other things that have happened, there is so much pent-up demand for digital transformation, both in the mind of the consumer, but also there's employees all around you saying, why are we not doing XYZ, right? So the risk is you come in and there's all this demand that's thrown at you, and you don't have time to take a step back and think about, are these the right things to solve? Or are there more fundamental things for me to first go solve, right? So being comfortable with sitting with that notion that, hey, there's all this pent-up demand for 5 years and we're still not making progress on it, and having the guts to still say, I think this is the right thing to do, is going to be, again, one of the, not doing that ends up with you failing in the long run, right? The fourth thing I would say is having a peanut butter strategy to how you are investing your resources. If you're going to try to make all the pent-up demand and everybody happy, then you're going to put in a few resources into everything. Instead, with digital transformation in particular, pick up 2 areas that are super important and take them to closure before you go back and invest more in other areas. So I'd say those are probably my, I think, top 4 reasons that I can think of for companies not setting themselves up for success.
Coming to a slightly different subject, you've been a woman in product for many years now, and having known you personally, you've done quite great. From your perspective, what are the unique challenges that you might have faced or opportunities that you might have gotten because you're a woman in product?
I don't know if it's fair to say there are more disadvantages than advantages. Probably not. I think there's 2 sides to the coin, if you will. But I will say, I think the most challenging thing for being a woman in product, and I've had a unique career in that I started my career in marketing, and maybe 10 years ago, I pivoted to product management. And when I was a marketing leader, I led a team that was predominantly women, right? It was, marketing as a function has a higher skew of women because it's considered a creative function, versus product management, which is considered more technical, just automatically has a much larger ratio of men to women. And so I remember my very first time leading a product organization, I led a team of all men, and I worked with an engineering team that also looked exactly like that. So it was very challenging to constantly feel like your voice sounds different in a room. You're struggling to be heard in conversations, right? And I think that tends to be a challenge. And today, things look different from 10 years ago. Obviously, things have gotten a lot better, but it continues to be a challenge, right? So I think, number one, not having enough people exactly like you. So if you have a vision of what you want to be 5 years from now, if there aren't enough people who look like you who do that today, it is challenging. And you wonder what are your chances at success in a space like that, right? I think number two, what was possibly interesting is, I feel product management as a space needs you to influence without authority massively, right? You do not own a lot of different functions, and you're going to have to go influence a whole bunch of people to walk in your direction, hopefully. And I do feel this is a potentially a gross generalization, and I also want to caveat it by saying I'm a woman and also an Asian woman and bring my own cultural perspective to it as well. But women tend to be permission seeking in how they approach things, right? Versus men tend to be a little bit more societally, just can come in and say, this is what we need to do, and then like rally people around it. And so I think that was something that I had to fundamentally change about my personality. And it is something I've heard a lot of women talk about, right? That you, in order to drive people in a certain direction, you need to make sure you don't seem like you're constantly permission seeking. So definitely something that's a fundamental shift. I'd say in ways that it has actually played to my advantage is, I would say, I think women tend to have greater empathy towards certain causes or specific topics. Again, all of this, I bet there are men listening to it who are also empathetic. So it's not one or the other, but as a generalization. And I would say that helped me a lot with being able to say, this is my consumer. I feel deeply passionate about who that consumer is and what I need to go and do and achieve for that consumer. Right. I would also say that, of course, there are, because we are in this era where we're operating from a playing field where enough women have not been represented, and we're trying to get more women to be represented. So that comes with its own opportunities, right? There are people who are out there seeking diversity. And so when you are in their path, automatically bigger opportunities come your way. I think the other area where women as product leaders really tend to have an impact is the managerial style as well as the building a product culture. I would say women are often primed to be listeners because you automatically tend to want to take in diverse perspectives and opinions into what you're trying to build. So that also lends itself really well to being able to listen to a consumer, being able to take in a lot of different perspectives and try to bring that together.
You recently went to Kellogg's and went back to school and did this program on Chief Product Officers. I'm curious to know, how is it to go back to school at this stage in your career? And how did it help you? What was your experience like? Would you recommend it?
I had an amazing experience going back to school, and I'll talk about the program specifically. But even before that, I would say there was a period in my life where I had spent about 11 years working in big tech. I had worked at Amazon for a big portion of that time. And I'm very grateful. That's where I learned product management. It's the best school of product management possibly. But at the same time, my entire perspective had started to become so internal looking. At one point, I just thought I would probably be there for the rest of my life, and everything was about, in and around Amazon, right? And I hit a particular point in my career where I just started to feel like I am not thinking outside of Amazon, and that's what took me to executive education. I started to get more and more curious about how do other people do product management. Is this how everybody thinks about it? What does Mercedes-Benz do versus somebody that's in e-commerce, right? How do these worlds differ from each other? I think the second piece was also around feeling like my entire network was really just people that I had worked with in a company that I'd been in, for almost a decade. And so wanting to get those diverse perspectives, build communities outside of that is what got me started on this journey, I'd say like 2 or 3 years ago. And, I zeroed in on a program called the Chief Product Officer program at Kellogg Business School. It's almost like a 16-month program, and it's a fairly intense program, right? You're spending at least 2 days a week on it for that entire period of time. There are some modules that you do on campus. There's a lot of teamwork across Zoom. What was amazing about being able to do that was, number one, as I said, at that point I was still at Amazon, and my path was to get to a CPO role. And I'd say that course helped me significantly in getting specific about what I wanted and what does this role involve, and does it really make sense, and is it interesting to me, number one. And then I think meeting different product leaders from across the board, going in and getting validated on how I thought about product, but also getting in some diverse perspectives from across the globe. And then lastly, just the network. I now have an amazing community of product leaders from different backgrounds that are all a text or a call away, right? I think just sometimes feeling like, oh my God, I'm dealing with this challenge and I want a different perspective. Everybody around me has vested interest or their own agenda. And I just want to be able to call somebody that's not in this world and ask them what they think about it. And I think that to me was probably the richest outcome of that program. So I would definitely recommend it. I would recommend just continuous learning, and not to end with business school, right? Which is what we all generally tend to do as life happens.
Are there any specific incidents or anything from your course that you would love to share?
I think what was really interesting on this course was there was this one module. It was about a telco company, and we were working as a team, and we basically had to go bid for licenses. We had to think about how to build this company up live, right? And we were all playing the role of you're the CEO, you're the CPO, you're XYZ, you're the CFO. How do we all come together and make this happen live? And we were competing with other teams with the exact same board composition of different backgrounds. And it was a really interesting experience because we were making these decisions live. And to me, that was my, before I actually ended up taking on a CPO role, that was my very first tryst with what type of decisions you end up making. So I thought that was a really cool moment on the program to feel like I was actually donning that hat without really donning it.
Priyanka, I think it was an amazing discussion with you. Before we end, what are the 3 main takeaways that you would like the audience to remember about the CPO role?
I feel like I've used the word data and customer like 10 times on your podcast already, but I'll say it again. I think that getting the data and consumers right and consumer understanding right and grounding people around it should be your number one job as you go in. Going in not with a yes dear mindset, but with a mindset of questioning everything and debating, but debating respectfully, is number 2. And then number 3 is just perseverance and empathy for both sides of the problem that you're trying to do. This is a tough job, and these, I think, are the 3 main inputs that set you up for success.
Great. That's wonderful. That was an amazing discussion, Priyanka. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Aseem. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed today's video and got some valuable insight. To continue getting these insights on product management, subscribe below to Product Bar Razors. And don't forget to like this video.